Okay, I'm Cindy Kelly. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's Wednesday, October 12, 2016, and I'm with Robert Howes. Bob, can you say your full name and spell it for us?
Okay, it's Robert I. Howes, and I better put Jr., and it's Howes.
Tell us when you were born and where.
Okay, I was born in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and August 3rd, 1941. And my parents at that time lived in Arroyo Chamisa area of Santa Fe. And then in 1943, my father was recruited up to Los Alamos. And I'm not sure the exact date. Most times were around April to August, because the apartment complexes were not finished until they started working on them in March of 1943. And so I was essentially under 2 years old when I first came to Los Alamos. And although I did finally graduate in 1959 from school there, so I spent my entire childhood in Los Alamos. And I kind of classify what do I remember doing the Manhattan Project, and not an awful lot. Some things I do remember, and one of the first things that is, I remember at one point that my parents got a call in the night, and they said there was a fire at the tech area. And I remember them being very, very worried. And it turns out that was early 1945. I've looked it up. It was in Richard the Rhodes Making Atomic Bomb mentions it. And it was in the machine shop where my father was director. So obviously they were very worried, because that was the height of the project. And it could have been very serious. And so I do remember that. I remember playing outside, and we were in the old sub-apartments very close to where the tech lab was. And so there was a Jeep security fence, and Jeeps drove around the road, what is now Canyon Road in Los Alamos. And I remember possibly our second dog or a dog running across the road and being hit by a Jeep. The Jeep ran over its head. The dog got up and ran away. It was a very dusty dirt road, and so nobody was injured. One of the other things I remember is there were a lot of children in Los Alamos, and so they decided to have a school bus. And I remember the school bus, first time it drove down the street, it opened the door, and people, kids got out like hamsters all over the place. And nobody was expecting them not to be civilized. Cars had to screech to a stop and everything. And after that, the parents got together and tried to make rules for such things like this. And the only other thing I can remember that was not pure hearsay was a girl in my neighborhood about my age or so died of leukemia, and so the parents all had to explain to everybody that she had passed and was very sick with a blood disease. Now the hearsay is more fun, because we moved into Los Alamos, and one of the things my parents had acquired as a wedding present about 3 or 4 years ago was a large dog named Chispa. Now, Chispa was half German Shepherd, half wolf, and half coyote. It was very large. And one of the first things Chispa apparently did is knocked a man named Nicholas Butler, that was the code name for Niels Bohr, off his bicycle. It's Santa Fe. Chispa had never seen a bicycle. And also, one point my mother came home and I was sticking a safety pin into Chispa, and Chispa was whining, and she asked why, and says, well, the doctor said the shot I got was good, so I'm giving a shot to Chispa. And Chispa just whined. Another story, and this is more, my sister remembers my parents telling us is that Chispa also was one of the few dogs in 1943 up in the hill. And because most people had not come from Santa Fe, they had come from New York or wherever, Chicago. And so all the mess soldiers at mess would bring Chispa bones, which was great. And one time they brought a white wrapped, kind of very large bone, and my mother looked at it and it looked like an uncooked steak. And a few minutes later, the sergeant or whatever from the mess said, "Did you look at that?" And she said, "Yes," and says, "Well, unfortunately, that was a steak meant for General Groves." And he looked at them and said, "Enjoy." And again, so that Chispa got General Groves steak and such. My father was an avid hunter. In fact, he came to New Mexico, and for 22 years, he hunted deer down near Magdalena, New Mexico, near Socorro. And every year he was successful. And so once he was loading up the car at 4 a.m. in the morning in front of the Sunt Apartments when security showed up. Here he is carrying rifles around and that. And they kind of said, "What are you doing? Who are you? And can somebody in the house explain, identify you?" And so he said, "Well, yes, but my wife and son are still asleep in there. Do you want me to wake them up? They'll be unhappy." And so they let him go, type thing. And one of the other kind of things, so we lived in the Sunt Apartments. So they're quads, they were called. And one of the other members or tenants in the Sunt Apartment was Enrico Ferme. And he was the one who kept the very erratic furnaces going during the wintertime. So it's always said he was both an experimentalist and a theoretist. And the experimentalists kept that going. And about 1946 or 7, new houses were built for us, and we moved out there. But for a child, it was a great place to be. It was very secure. You could go any place you wanted to. And could play in the canyons, and the security would watch out for, they knew the kids would sneak under the fences into the canyons. And they would just keep an eye on them, so make sure they were all right when they snuck back and such. And that's, I think that's all I can remember, per se. Oh, the only other thing with my father and the deer was, he was very successful in getting large mule deer bucks with lots of horns, and so he would trade them with Santa Clara Pueblo, give them so they could use them in their deer dance, and then result for Halloween, they would give me official real war paint I could wear for Halloween.
So there was a nice camaraderie between at least some people on the hill and the Pueblos, at least the...
Yes, well, many people up there had maids. Now this was later when in Western area. I think this was probably after a little more after the Manhattan Project. I don't think people in the Sunt quadrants, quads had maids, but then later on there was a lot of employment for, as I understand, the Pueblo women and that. And, they obviously visited, many scientists collected pots. There are a lot of people who still probably have Maria pots that, or blankets and such things like this. So yes, I think there was a bus that came up, I've been told, every day from the Pueblos, not for the people to work up there. But Los Alamos was a closed society in the sense it was a company town. You could not own your own home. And you had to work at Los Alamos as a scientist, essentially, to be employed. So hence many of the construction workers lived in White Rock. And initially some people lived in camps in Bandelier before there was housing for them. And so eventually in about 1956 or 7, my father really wanted to own his own home. And so we moved off the hill to an old place in in Nambe, which had no water, light, or electricity. And we started from there. It was a 300-year-old house. And so from there on, we both commuted up to Los Alamos and until the end of his career, until I graduated and went off to college. So, I think that's about it, what I remember.
It's interesting. Now you say, what was your mother working, or did she stay home with you?
She was a homemaker. She did do a little substituting at one point, and I guess my sister and I screamed loud enough, and she went back. She stopped it, but it was kind of interesting that many of our teachers going through grade school and high school would work for a while as teachers, and then they would take a break and they would work for the lab, get tired of that and go back. And I realized now that's probably for teachers a very good thing to do. You take a break from teaching. And that's, so we had really some very sharp teachers. Of course, it was a government-run facility at that time. And as a matter of fact, two people I knew at one point broke into the school and stole some things. But they didn't realize that was a federal crime. And the FBI tracked them down because they wore brand new tennis shoes on a waxed floor. And so their feet were traced right out to, and they had left fingerprints or something like this. But it was a federal crime. So it was the government ran the school in Los Alamos and that. And again, until I think in the late 50s or 60s, you could not own your own home. In fact, that was the funny thing. When they didn't allow people to own their own home, they thought everybody would build in Santa Fe Pueblo style. But nope, they built in Cape Cod style. They built in Georgia Manor style. Wherever they were from, they built the house in that style, and not very rarely adobe. So it just shows you the variety in Los Alamos that came there and worked there.
So do you have any sense that when the war ended that many of that the population decreased because people left, or what was it like when the war ended?
There was a discussion, obviously. My parents, I know, discussed. There were many, people around the neighborhood did leave, or some did. A lot stayed. And my father's older brother was an engineer for General Electric in California. I know they considered, but they really liked Santa Fe. Of course, they had come to Santa Fe in 1936, and so they spent a good, 6-7 years in the area, and so they were happy to stay, even though I think the job got more and more trying as years went on. And my father finally retired in 1973 under the RIF program, Reduction in Force program. And he was happy because the University of California ran Los Alamos during the war and such and after. And so all the retirement benefits were based on living in California versus living in Nambe or Santa Fe. So they were very happy with their retirement income, living in Santa Fe. And people from California still come here and are very happy at the lower cost of living.
So did you find that many people who moved away came back in retirement?
I think some did, and of course some, after the war, there were, I guess, a lot of academics who went back to their universities, and then they would come back later. One that comes to mind is Manley. I forget what his first name, but he had two daughters about my age, and so they went away after the war, I think to University of Washington or something, and then came back to Los Alamos to work for a while. And so I would go skiing with his daughters up in Taos. Los Alamos had a ski run, Taos had a ski run, Santa Fe had a ski run. So it was a very good place to learn to ski in that, and extremely inexpensive.
So do you recall any classmates who were Hispanic or Native American?
Hispanic in high school. Of course, by that time, I think people who were like contractors, or what they call Zia, who was did maintenance and that. They lived in, actually, there was a trailer park across the mesa from Los Alamos, and so, but yeah, there were quite a few Hispanics. I still remember, because some of them, they were generally smaller, and when they would be, they were deceptive when they played football, because they were extremely tough and such. But as far as knowing individual Hispanics at that time, or particularly Native Americans, I think must have gone to schools, and Indian school or whatever, because I don't recall any. Most of the people that I ran around with were, children of people employed at Los Alamos, as scientists and such. And I just can't remember any.
A few minutes ago, you showed me your pass.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Well, everybody at Los Alamos, regardless what age, had to have a pass to show going in and out of Los Alamos, at least during the war, and for a considerable time after the war, because it was a restricted city. So we laugh because the first picture shows me about 6 inches below the 4-foot line. So I must have been about 3 or 4, I think, when that was taken. And so there's a gradual progression in that. But and I do remember showing the pass to get out of Los Alamos and that. But again, for kids, it was a great place. And a great place to bicycle, whatever.
So what was the population?
I think between 7,000 and 13,000. I don't know if it was. I remember the figure 13,000 eventually, and that. And of course, initially, I guess everybody walked to work, and a lot of people still did. Even when we lived in the western area, it was possible to walk across. They built a bridge across the canyon to where the administrative buildings of Los Alamos are now, and a lot of. So it was a very, I would say, healthy city, and. Since my father liked to hunt and do things like this, he would often take other scientists with him to hunt and fish, because he was familiar with the area. He had originally come out, and he worked, well, like many people, he came out because he had a spot of tuberculosis. And in fact, my mother was in the Sun Mountain Sanatorium in Santa Fe originally. And so he then got a job working for the Indian Service and then the Corps of Civil Engineers building dams. And so every once in a while he'd drive by and say, oh, I helped build and design that dam. And one of the ones that if you ever drive through Tasuki village, there are 2 kind of fishing ponds, and there have been for years and years. They may be dried up now. He would say, I helped design those 2. And then eventually he got a job working for, I always called it breeze burners, but it was oil field services that made oil burner lights and heating for oil burners. And he thought that was much better than a gas burner. He, in fact, as late as 1995, he had one in his shop, because he said it kept you better warmed. But so he was able to, knowing the territory, take people around a little bit. And I think Oppenheimer did the same thing, and he knew the area.
Do you remember trips into Santa Fe?
Not really. Occasionally, I remember my mother telling about when Los Alamos had a lot of switchbacks and was dirt road when they came up there. And so she, because she knew people like, to the people, the Dr. Frank Mera of Sun Mountain Sanatorium, and our other good friend was Mike Otero, who was, he was the son of the first territorial governor of New Mexico. And so my parents would go down and see him. My mother occasionally would drive down for some reason to Santa Fe. And they would give her a good stiff drink of scotch and send her back up to Los Alamos to survive the switchbacks. And that's so. And one of the other people that this Michael Terrace, wife was Catherine Stinson Altera. Of course, Stinson, her brothers were the Stinson brothers. And so at some point in the 36s and 1936 and so, my mother also was taken up in planes with had open floorboards and such where you could look down at the ground. But so Santa Fe had a very active, in fact, that also reminds me of one other remembrance, and that is Los Alamos Airport was small. You know, you could ride a small plane into it. But one time, a large kind of bomber-type aircraft had to land there and got stuck in the mud, and everybody could hear it coming in for landing, all over Los Alamos. And I guess they emptied out everything to make it light enough to take off again. But it was a mistake that they brought the plane in. It was not meant for very large runways and such. So that must have been right after the war and such.